Welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of Decline and Fall as the British Empire, or what's left of it, continues to slide rapidly down the pit of despair into the plains of oblivion. Who else but Keir Starmer to lead it on its final journey to ultimate destruction? A more appropriate man to stick on the front cover of this particular issue of a magazine entitled Oblivion, one could not find. Who better than a bunch of security state goons and political inadequates to guide the British Empire into its final resting place in a sandbank in the North Sea? And that is who we're going to be talking about today. But also we have more news from West Asia, more news involving Donald Trump, and some other things besides. Kit Clarenberg, from your vantage point in an undisclosed location in the future Yugoslavia, how are you feeling about the fate of Sir Keir today?
Well, I mean, I am quite tempted. I'm not a betting man in the commercial sense of the term, but I am quite willing to whack a ton of cash that I don't have on Starmer not being in the post in a few weeks' time. At this rate, I think that, like, it is, yes, as you say, it's hilarious that for someone who was quite clearly groomed and protected, probably from a very early age, actually, to occupy the position that he's in now, which has involved concealing the crimes of Jimmy Savile, deliberately, concertedly shielding MI5 and MI6 agents from prosecution for torture, despite British police collating tens of thousands of incriminating documents on them, and burning any and all CPS papers related to the persecution of Julian Assange. It was quite clearly, hoped that he would deliver on some level. Now, he might be delivering to his MI5 and MI6 handlers by continuing to allow British spy planes to surveil Gaza to assist the Zionist entity's 21st century Holocaust. But at home, things are going very, very, very badly. And they're going so badly that it can't really be concealed anymore. And there is now, as we shall see, there is Caitlin Johnston wrote a fantastic article for her Substack on how there is a sudden media shift on Gaza. Like, the entire tone has shifted to one of condemnation and disgust with what's been happening for the past 18 months for the very first time. And she makes the point that, well, there's been a consensus shift, and no mainstream outlet wants to be the last one that was holding out, is supporting the previous consensus when the new ones come in. And I think that we're seeing that with Starmer's supporters. Now, I saw a very funny meme on Twitter of titled Keir Starmer's response to the local election results, and it was a picture of Edward Norton in Fight Club transforming into Edward Norton as a neo-Nazi in American History X, which I think is quite apropos as a visual metaphor for what's been emanating from his stupid mouth ever since they got absolutely whomped by reform.
Which they were always going to do, because, as we covered a number of months ago, actually, as we have said repeatedly, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are not popular. They're not popular, and never were. They won the election last year basically because the Tory party sabotaged itself and were ruinously unpopular anyway. And also, this points to the role of reform and its strategic deployment by the British ruling class at certain points, as, by the way, they used to deploy UKIP at certain times, as they deploy Nigel Farage at certain points and retire him at certain points and then bring him back again. So Nigel Farage, of course, was brought back to give reforms campaign in the general election of last year, and it's hard to believe it is only a year ago
I know,
that the
wild,
general election actually
wild.
occurred. Yeah, feels like 10. I mean, it was about a year ago that Rishi Sunak made that bizarre speech saying he was going to bring
In
back national service, thus completely sinking any chance he had of staving off a total humiliation. And you have to
yes,
believe that that was quite deliberate. Also, the bringing back of Farage and him being run in Clacton, and the sudden massive boost that Reform got in terms of press coverage is all designed to make sure that the Tories got completely scalped and Labour got as big a majority as possible in order that Keir Starmer could follow through on providing a stable government for the ruling class for the next few years and get through some of the things that they were very keen on, which is, of course, continuing the Ukraine war and doing remilitarization. Now, as this isn't popular amongst the wider population, Keir Starmer had then to somehow find another thing to do, besides, of course, cutting winter fuel payments for old age pensioners, attacking benefit claimants, and presiding over the further collapse of British industry. So what does he do after what was the inevitable victory of Reform in the local elections? Well, steal Reform's platform, or more to the point, steal the platform of like the more extreme end of Reform, which is give a migration speech, which is being criticised for sounding like Enoch Powell. But this is not the first time this has happened. Tony Blair and David Blunkett used to sound like Enoch Powell from time to time. In fact, they would do this in a way that would guarantee them good press and good headlines, because the way in which the immigration issue is used by the Labour Party in particular is that it is quite deliberately used to funnel working class discontent towards the immigration question. That's what this is about. This is a game they've been playing for decades. They played this game in the 50s with migration from the Caribbean nations, former British colonies. They played this game in the 70s with immigration into the country from Uganda, particularly the Ugandan Asians. The Labour Party has consistently been as racist as the Tories in terms of their deployment of immigration as a political issue. So in this sense, to say that Keir Starmer is somehow acting outside of Labour Party traditions is a joke. This is how they've always been. This is what Jack Straw and David Blunkett and others spent years doing when they were in office, when I was like in my teens and 20s. This was exactly the kind of thing that they used to do every other week. So that Starmer would do this it only surprises that it took him a year, because he was actually campaigning along these lines in the general election anyway. He just would sort of not put it all into one speech. Now he's basically repeated a line that Powell used, that 20 years ago William Hague used, and it's going to have similar results, which is that nobody's going to believe him. The people who are going to vote for Reform are going to vote for Reform no matter what he says. And the people who are going to be alienated by this are the sort of what I would call the squishy liberal types who are stupid enough to think that wearing a suit and speaking in, shall we say, stock phrases pre-approved by the media is what statesmanlike behavior looks like. And they're not going to be impressed by it either. In fact, they're going to run off and vote for the Green Party, which is just as bad. But Kit, what was your response to Enoch Starmer and his rivers of boredom?
Well, I mean, I think that the historical context that you provided, a lot of which I didn't actually know, much to my shame. It's very rare that I admit that, by the way, not knowing something. But anyway, the point is yeah, that, like, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, yes, when Tony Blair and David Blunkett were like banging the drum about asylum seekers. Now the term is migrants, but it was asylum seekers back then, and the Labour officials and Blair himself took a very hard line on this. They imposed the tightest most strictest immigration rule, the kind of quote unquote irregular immigration rules in Europe by far, with also which included a kind of catch-22 component, which was if you go to the UK with a passport, then this invalidates any asylum claim because you've been able to safely and freely leave your country. And if you turn up without your papers, this invalidates your claim because you don't have papers. But anyway, yes, it is remarkable it has taken Starmer so long to do this. And I think that actually one of the reasons that he has engaged in all of this rhetoric, which it wasn't just restricted to this speech where, yes, he as good as quoted Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech verbatim, talking about being, strangers in our own land. There has been a series of tweets where he's trying to play hard man, boasting about how many illegals he's personally sent back home, and he's not going to stop there. And the reason that he's doing this, on top of everything that you've just very eloquently articulated, Alex, is because the entire liberal, or as good as the entire liberal pundit class, who were central to the destruction and sabotage of Corbyn's project, and were hardcore fluffers for Starmer while he was campaigning for leader and secretly briefing that all of his pledges to maintain Corbyn's modest social democratic policies were total lies, and they would be dumped the second that he won. Were cheering his victory, and talking about how this was going to be revolutionary and the adults are back in charge, have now all turned on him. Now, this is Ian Dunn, who is one of these scumbags who's responsible for ruining Corbyn's leadership and laying the foundations for Starmer's win and cheering it at the top of his absolute lungs ever since. At one stage, he disgustingly, Ian Dunn had the temerity to publish a column saying the working class composition of Starmer's cabinet shows whose side they're on. And the benefits that will flow for working class Britons as a result. I mean, the guy should be in Guantanamo. But anyway, yes, Ian Dunn of the last holdout on Starmer has now comprehensively thrown him under the bus and has said Starmer is as bad as those who came before him. We've seen a lot of negative comment about Starmer in the Guardian, and I think that there's probably some idiot in Labour HQ who's like, right, well, yes, as you've lost the squishy Liberal vote, it's time to go after Reform and Tory voters even harder than you were before. And I think it is quite clearly a desperate final bid, which is going to fall flat on its face, as with most things related to Starmer. But yes, that I excuse me. I am completely unsurprised by the tone that's been issuing, given historical from Starmer and others, given historical precedents, and it is absolutely hilarious to watch, as I mentioned, all of these rats fleeing the sinking ship. Supertansky, who's this internet personality who suddenly became interested in politics after Brexit and became this very prominent anti-Corbyn online commentator, and was cheerleading a Labour victory, has suddenly decided that centrists are pieces of shit and that she wants to move to France. Because of everything that Labour is doing. She wants to flee Starmer's Britain to the clutches of Le Pen.
That noted progressive.
Well,
just got to say for a minute, like these fucking clowns are like some of the stupidest people in Britain, and that says a lot. Because like they have a view of like France and Germany and Italy and Spain as being like these beacons of progress compared to old perfidious Albion. Now, yes, if you've worked out the nature of the people who run Britain, then you are going to think that anywhere else would be better. But then again, I would urge anybody who thinks that to go away and do your research into exactly who runs France and who has always run France. They're not any better. They were just a little bit less successful in terms of mass murder and ripping off the entire world. They got conquered a couple of times. The British were saved by a sea. I mean, do I need to talk about the Germans, current or past form? Just in case anybody out there wants to make, I'll say this for the benefit of Owen Jones, because Owen, I know you watched the show. I remember Owen's ravings about like how great Germany was a few years back, and how it would be better, wouldn't it be better if Britain was like Germany? West Germany was built on the foundations of the officialdom from the Third Reich and US imperialist money. So that's the foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany. So in case anybody's wondering, do we need to talk about Italy? Do you know who ran that place until until 1943? Spain, Portugal. Look, just because somewhere has better wine and better food than Britain, again, not a fucking stretch, doesn't mean that it's not got a brutal imperialist history, you know? I think some of these people think that they're sophisticated, but in actual fact, what they actually show is just in a flip, that they are the flip side of like the parochial reactionaries. They're like parochial progressives, in that like they can't see outside of the incredibly narrow limits of like what life in old perfidious Albion is, and think that anything outside of it other than Trump land is going to be better. Look, all these people need to get off Twitter for a while and do some fucking research. We have a back catalogue. They are more than welcome to view that, read your work, and pick up a fucking book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I mean, one of the things that I found, I mean, we've spoken about this before on the show, but it seems like a good opportunity to repeat it. Like, look, yeah, I mean, I remember very, very, very clearly, like 10 years ago, when yes, Guardianistas and people kind of followers of Owen Jones fetishized Germany to an absolutely insane degree, and oh, they've got rent controls and blah 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 blah, and it's just like ignoring the fact that Germany is also the key facilitator of Israel's illegal nuclear program. It has this bizarre history of state-sanctioned paedophilia within recent memory. Moves in lockstep with the exception of has moved in lockstep with the exception of Iraq, with the US on everything. Their spying agencies are effectively run by the CIA. As if I mean, but what's even more striking is that these people not only conveniently overlook that, but like now that the reality of these countries has been kind of amply exposed, I would say, over the course of the special military operation and the Gaza genocide. I mean, we're seeing the true face of all of these supposedly shiny social democracies. Like the same crowds who were venerating and fetishizing the continent 10 years ago, they have zero alternatives now. Like norovirus media and Owen Jones, they're critical of Starmer and Labour, but they're not proposing any alternatives whatsoever. And occasionally they might have some guest on who is a bit left field, like very, very, very occasionally. But like, I mean, you look on their among the most. I saw a podcast of theirs doing the rounds where they sit down and talk to Kenneth Roth, who's like the head of Human Rights Watch, which is this like US imperial appendage and has been central to regime change operations in every corner of the world. And it's like it's they've kind of passed the dump point of just being bitterly disappointed and
Mm,
oh well, I had my hopes dashed. They're literally just relentlessly critical to an extent of certain things that the establishment is doing, but they have no answers whatsoever at all.
mm.
No
No.
alternatives.
Well, they and also like let's be honest, like what Norovirus Media wanted and what Aaron Bastani wanted when he formed that company was to essentially be the new media successor to The Guardian, in so a certain extent, or be welcomed into The Guardian. And he's
Yes,
got that
yes.
now. This is what all of these people wanted. And I've been aware of these people and have interacted with them for over 14, 15 years now, since like the university occupations of the early 2010s, where I first became aware of them. Aaron Bastani has a tendency to dance all the way up to something radical, then shit his pants and run away from it at the first opportunity when things get a bit heated. And his invitation to various different establishment events might be withdrawn. We must remember, of course, that he was very prominent in essentially calling for two women who wore T-shirts with paragliders on them
Mm.
after October the 7th to essentially be charged as terrorists and tossed in jail. So he's like he
And
is
they were charged. They were charged and
yeah,
prosecuted. They thankfully weren't jailed.
yeah,
But yeah, he was doing the Fed's works for them. Shocking,
yeah, which is
unpardonable.
unforgivable bullshit from him. But then again, that's the state of so-called new media in Britain. Like which is that they all want to be invited to the big table. They all essentially, all of them, with a few honourable exceptions, circulate around or orbit around the Labour Party. That's what new media ended up doing. From about those who started 15 years ago very quickly got absorbed into the Labour Party trade union bureaucracy atmosphere. And if you relate this to the topic of our program today, if that's where you go, your politics become objectively pro-imperialist, which is why norovirus media might shout and scream on Palestine, but they won't really talk too much about the role of the Labour Party historically or currently on Palestine. They'll say that Starmer's awful, but they won't say that, for instance, the Zionist state was begun under a Labour government. And they're very prominent members of that government, including on the left, including Nye Bevan, the guy who founded the NHS, were Labour Party Zionists and were very enthusiastic about it being started. Or the fact that the British nuclear program really has its roots partly in the wartime coalition government, but also in the post-World War II Labour Party government. Again, enthusiastically trumpeted by Ernest Bevin, a rabid chauvinist and a man who favoured the preservation of the British Empire. Again, norovirus media aren't going to talk about that. So let's turn it back to like the current day and like what we're talking about here, which is that look, Starmer is not an exception to Labour Party leaders of the past. The difference is that whereas Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, or even Blair offered a few reforms that at least benefited some sections of the working class, Starmer offers absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so even if he goes full bore racist, which he's trying to, and I'm convinced that conversion is very sincere, this is not going to work for him because he's offering nothing. At least Farage and Reform can just portray themselves as perpetually oppositional. Starmer is an establishment figure to the very core of his being, and therefore he's not convincing when he tries to portray himself as like taking an about face, because not only is he an establishment figure and everybody knows it, he's also an extremely bad liar, which must have made him an extremely terrible lawyer.
Well, isn't lawyer Latin for liar? But no, I kid. That is a reference to Arrested Development. But but yeah, just to round this out, and this is something I've included in the show note. We don't need to listen to this woman talk. Just get up the Times Radio tweet.
Yes.
So Anne Widdecombe is for our viewers outside the UK. Anne Widdecombe is about the most batshit hard right conservative that you could imagine in British politics. She has been nicknamed the Blue Nun. For her, for her stances on abortion, climate change, just like pretty much everything. She has like the most batshit lunatic take imaginable. And apparently, Boris Johnson wrote about this in a book he authored on his campaign for election in 2001 as an MP. He stated that she was absolutely beloved by local conservative associations, and it was very difficult to give speeches after her. And he said it was like trying to sexually please someone who just achieved climax in the arms of Errol Flynn, following Anne Widdecombe talking. But yeah, so Anne Widdecombe, this batshit far right Tory who was a key founder of the founding member of the Brexit Party, which became one way or another reform. She is to the left of Starmer on immigration. She says we never signed up to zero immigration. Essential NHS and care workers should be considered exceptions to immigration policy, which they're not under Labour. Like it's unreal. Like you are trying to outflank a right wing party, making yourself look terrible. With all of your key audiences and all of your remaining few supporters in the media, and then Anne Widdecombe of all people is telling you that's a bit harsh.
Well, the interesting thing is that Reform's actual manifesto does reflect what Anne Widdecombe said there, which is that what Reform ran on isn't zero immigration. There's a lot of like big talk from like Nigel Farage, but you get down into what they actually say, and they say we will have exceptions for key skills that are needed in the economy, which is like care workers, NHS, and stuff like that, and also basically provides business with a get out clause to say we need this amount of immigration in industry X, Y, and Z. So Reform is not for zero immigration. That's the image Reform gives off, because Nigel Farage isn't stupid. He knows how to sort of dance this dance and has been doing so for many years, which is you give the impression that that's what you're in favor of, and you fully expect that nobody will ever really read or actually interrogate what you actually say in the things you're committing to. And it's very clear in black and white in the Reform manifesto. They are not in favor of zero immigration because they're a pro-capitalist party running in an imperialist country, like which is dependent upon migration to fill like low-paid positions in multiple industries for many decades. He knows that. Like him, Richard Tice and others, they know what their job is. Their job is to gather up the discontent, funnel it down the reform path, and then basically deliver the same immigration policy that the Tories would, which is a lot of noise and a lot of repressive measures, but make sure that the Labour keeps flowing because that's what's required. Ultimately, that's where Starmer's bill will end up as well, by the way, because again, Labour Party's done this dance over different waves of immigration going back to the 50s now. Every time some right-wing force or some fascistic force pops up, the Labour Party immediately panders to it. And then it goes back towards what was ultimately always the policy, which is how much Labour does business need? And we'll go out and get it for them. And then we'll tell the discontented working class to be racist, that they can be racist against the new arrivals. Keep the working class divided. Keep everybody like in fear of and like wanting to fight each other. That's the general plan. Whilst at the same time, keep doing the bidding of the capitalist class who need that constant level of migrant labour coming in. This is the game. And they're all playing it. It's just that Starmer has decided to go way over the top, trying to make up for lost ground, which isn't even going to work. Now, what will happen is Farage and those in Reform will say, you see, the reason why he's gone so far is because he doesn't mean it. We mean it. We'll do it. Welcome to the year of Nigel.
Yeah. Yeah, stop the boats. The part three, but on the subject of stopping boats, funnily enough,
Mm,
I think this is a clunky, if useful segue into something that just caught my eye in the New York
mm,
Times. Now, we have spoken on Decline and Fall several times about how the Trump's renewed hostilities against Ansarallah were always going to fail. They were going to result in yet another embarrassing defeat for the empire in the Red Sea. I have previously suggested on prior broadcasts that negative coverage in the mainstream media of the engagement was indicative of the fact that the Pentagon wanted it over. Because
mm.
they were expending so many difficult to replace and extremely expensive munitions on achieving nothing. Now, here we go with the New York Times. I believe it was on May 12th, so a few days ago now. They published this like pretty jaw-dropping report, kind of call it a post-mortem on the failure of the Trump administration's renewed war against Ansarallah. Now, you've got to bear in mind, when this first started in mid-March, there were US officials who were saying this is going to go on indefinitely. Trump was talking a big game about decimating Ansarallah and their leadership. The New York Times reveals that after the first month of engagements, Trump ordered a status report. It concluded that the US had failed to achieve air superiority over Ansarallah, that Reaper drones were being shot down at an unprecedented rate, and the US had spent $1 billion in the first month alone. And I might add as well, due to their lack of air superiority over Ansarallah, who overwhelmingly use drones with costing tens of dollars with explosives attached to them, like the risk of US casualties, whether that's naval or airmen, was like a constant threat. A constant
Mm.
threat. They were being bombarded that much by Ansarallah. And yeah, it just goes on and on and on. That like it states that Omani officials, because the deal between the US and Ansarallah under which US ships alone will be exempt from the blockade, but Ansarallah can continue to act as it wishes towards the Zionist entity. Like Omani officials reached out on their behalf, offering them an off ramp as long as Israel was not involved in the talks. And Trump accepted the offer because they were losing so badly, right?
Mm.
Like that's like. And what's even more incredible, yes, I mentioned US officials said that this was going to carry on indefinitely. The Pentagon's CENTCOM commander, this is the area of the Pentagon's purview that specifically covers like Iran, Central Asia. They had originally planned for an 8 to 10 month campaign, right? Like this was meant to go on for almost a year. And
Yeah.
there were people within the power structure who thought that this was seriously plausible. And not only that, it goes into the fact that the targeting data that the US was using had been provided by the Saudis. This
Mm.
is after the Saudis spent 8 years bombing Yemen to no avail.
Mm.
Probably not the people you want to be consulting on how to prosecute a war against Ansarallah.
No.
And in the process, not only F-16 fighters, but F-35 stealth fighters were repeatedly nearly shot down by
Mm.
Ansarallah. Of course, in the manner of these things, the Yemen campaign blew through precision munitions at an unprecedented scale. To the point that Pentagon contingency planners basically told the White House, you need to stop because we're like running dangerously low on stockpiles. A ground offensive, as we on Decline and Fall, we have speculated that a ground offensive could be in the offing. The New York Times reports this was considered, and the US spoke to UAE and Saudi officials about doing it. Now, the Saudis actually did invade Yemen. I believe it was in 2018. And they had British soldiers and special forces with them, and they got their asses handed to them. So, of course, these talks came to nothing and no consensus was reached. Like, I strongly urge our listeners, and this will be included in our and viewers, this will be included as ever in our show notes, which go out regularly on our Substack. Please subscribe if you haven't already. It's worth going over this in detail, because, like, at the risk of self-aggrandizement that is vomit-worthy, we were telling you from day one of this on Decline and Fall that it was not going to result in anything.
Yeah.
And there is another point to make here, which again I might have already made. But I think that the key takeout, on top of this being a massive defeat for the US empire, to take lessons from the anti-imperialists of everywhere can take lessons from, is you got to bear in mind of how much of the US's military power is completely illusory. Right. And a lot of people who should know better buy into this. I had conversation in the wake of Operation Prosperity Guardian, which was launched with much fanfare by the Biden administration at the end of 2023 and ended in 2024, having achieved nothing, used hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missiles to shoot down Ansar Allah drones. Early reports stated that pilots were traumatized from the experience. US pilots were traumatized from the experience because they'd never been shot at before. Right? Like, like I had conversations with people I know who should know better about this pretty historic defeat for the US Navy. And a common response was something to the effect of, well, I mean, the US could still go in and smash them if they wanted to. Could they?
No.
Because they failed to do so twice in less than a year now.
Well, also, let's just revisit that Saudi incursion in 2018, which is that where was that planned? It was planned in an operations center run by British and US officers inside Saudi Arabia itself. As you said, it included British special forces and British instructors and Americans. Like, it was Saudi being used essentially to do the same job on the Yemenis that they're trying to get the Ukrainians to do on the Russians, and it was a complete disaster. I would also say that, like, this was always the case, that the imperialists can do a lot of damage, they can kill a lot of people, they can destroy a lot of things, but they can't win wars. Like the US, if we need to recap, lost in Korea. They were unable to meet their objectives. They really lost badly in Vietnam. They were able to beat Grenada, big deal. They were able to beat Panama. They were able to destroy Iraq following what? Already turning Iraq into a puppet to be used against Iran, getting it largely destroyed, very much half destroyed by Iran, then destroying what was left in the 1990s, then finally knocking over the absolutely sort of skeletal remains in 2003. This isn't a good record. So what the Yemenis proved was that if you, as Ansar Allah have done, which is that they have forged through many years of war and also political activity, a coalition that stretches all the way across like Yemeni society to mobilize people en masse, to also train like a very effective army. Like, you see those images of like guys in flip-flops running around with Kalashnikovs. Those are some of their fighters, but the core of it is actually the old Yemeni army, which defected en masse and actually provides the backbone of the fighting force of Ansar Allah, who are objectively better motivated, better led, and have much better tactical awareness than those clowns who were running the show for the Saudis, which is why the Saudis don't want to go back in again, because they know it would be a disaster. And I mean, to go to the claim that the US will just smash them, based on what? based on what possible historical evidence would that be the case? When has the US or the British been able to actually win this kind of war? They can't. I mean, I mean, it's a bit of a, people would expect me to say this, but you go back to Chairman Mao's observation that US imperialism is a paper tiger. It always has been. This is the thing. What we're seeing now is to paraphrase Stalin, it's the material reality finally asserting itself in a very real way, which is that for many years, many people in the neo-colonial world, in the parts of the world that were seeking to free themselves from US, British, French domination, saw the imperialists as almost unbeatable, thanks to the Soviet collapse and the counter-revolution of 1991, etc. Now everybody's caught up with the fact that, oh, these people can't fight. They don't want to fight. They can't mobilize. The US could not mobilize an army to go into Yemen because they would lose badly and it would destabilize things inside the US itself. Same reason they can't fight the Russians, same reason they won't and can't fight the Iranians, and they can't fight the Chinese. So this is the limit. You're seeing the limitations of US imperial power now. Trump took a deal and ran away, just as Biden would have, just as any US president would have when faced with this reality.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, it's just, I mean, it is, and as I say, I mean, throughout the special military operation, the limits of US and European power have been very, very, very large, and it does like that. And we'll get into this in further detail, but like the tone of this New York Times piece, but also the pronouncements of US officials on so many matters recently has been one which, while often striking a kind of strident or at least kind of belligerent bullying tone, they sound like pathetic and pleading, you know. Like even Trump was like compelled to basically pay homage to the Ansarallah, and saying that, you know, they took a hell of a beating. You know, they were oh, word escapes me. They were a formidable opponent. And you know, we've reached a peace. Like you know, he wasn't saying like, oh yeah, like, you know, we crushed them and they backed away and they signed a peace deal with us, like, and this is a victory. He was as good as admitting this was a defeat. And I think as well that this, when you tie this in with the again, we'll get into this in more detail, but like a lot of the messaging that's emerging around the Iran talks on the nuclear negotiations. You got to bear in mind that that when Trump was elected, there was widespread speculation that he was going to give Israel a blank check to go to war with Iran and would be assisting them in this. Initially, his administration took a very, very, very belligerent, bellicose stance on Iran. Lots of very fiery rhetoric, which made a lot of independent analysts who I respect and you know, think usually have got their heads screwed on correctly. They were extremely worried about a direct military confrontation between the US and Iran, as we've gotten into on prior editions of Decline and Fall. This can't and won't happen because they know, the US knows it would be crushed.
Yes.
Right. So like to turn this back to the nuclear negotiations again, there are very clear indications that the US wants to get this wrapped up very, very quickly and with ever greater urgency. You know,
Yes.
that they went into this with threats, and they moved, you know, B-52 bombers to Diego Garcia to, you know, boost their bargaining position. And now they're a bit like, please, 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 just sign something and get this over and done with. Yeah. Like, you know, it's quite amazing actually.
Yeah, because they've got nothing. Like they think, or they thought, I think maybe this is Trump's delusion, that they could allow the Israelis to go and bomb nuclear sites in Iran, just like they allowed the Israelis to go and do that to Iraq in the early 1980s. But Iran in 2025 is not Iraq in 1982. This is a much, much tougher proposition. And the reason why, as we have covered before, the Israelis didn't follow up their attempt to attack Iran with anything more was because the Iranian air defenses locked onto their fighters, and that would have been game over. And that would have been a loss that Netanyahu politically could not stomach. And so, and as we've kept saying, what is the US plan for war in Iran? What, they can't get the Israelis to fight it for them. No one else is going to fight it for them. The only plan that they have, them and the British, is more terrorism, more assassinations, more attempts at color revolution and destabilization operations, which haven't worked for 30 years and aren't going to work now. So the only thing that they've got is this sort of desperate scheme to try and get some agreement out of the Iranian government that they can present as some kind of win, when in reality, all Trump's managed to do by tearing up the JCPOA and essentially dialing up the hostility to Iran is in actual fact push Iran into a much more developed relationship with the Chinese and the Russians, which isn't going to be reversed now, because there are some in Iran who would roll over and play dead for the US, but they're not the majority by any means. And the revolutionaries in Iran who want to stay true to the legacies of 1979, they want to continue the progress that they've made in terms of the relationship with the BRICS, in terms of the building of the economic relationship and security relationship with China and Russia. That's not going to change. And so whatever Trump does now isn't going to change that. And he even though he's realized he can't go to war with them, they don't know what else to do either. So should we turn to then discuss the Israel question? Because I think that this is an important one, because now we've got this meeting that Trump has been to in Saudi Arabia. He's been meeting in the Gulf states and sort of and again, the Gulf states, if nothing else, are good at pandering, and they pander to Trump, etc. Now, what's gone on in recent weeks is that the Israelis have become disturbed, apparently, by the fact that Trump signed off on the peace deal with the Yemenis without consulting with the Israelis at all. Mike Huckabee, who's this sort of evangelist sort of caricature from Arkansas, who was meant to be like the most pro-Israel US ambassador to Israel ever, turned around and says, well, we didn't have to ask your permission to sign deals with anybody. And it goes to show that those of us, and I include us as in myself and Kit here presenting this program, and others who have said over many years now that Israel is a tool, was set up as a tool of the British, continues as a tool of the US and the British. And if it's no longer able to provide the value that it once did, it will be shut down and disposed of. Just the same way that in the end, white Rhodesia was, just as in the end, white apartheid South Africa was. And this is where Israel's heading now. Because there's a severe split in the US ruling class over the value of it. Many in the US ruling class, represented by the likes of Thomas Friedman, are saying that, well, it's Netanyahu's fault. He's ruined everything. If we can just get rid of him, then we can rebalance things. Israel itself is in huge economic difficulty, is very divided internally, and is ruled over by a strange collection of like religious fanatics, open fascists, and a corrupt sort of gangsterish figure in the form of Netanyahu. And even the Trump administration has started to work out that that being with them no matter what is not exactly a very good idea.
Yeah, well, it's what's really interesting is that if you go back like literally 15 years, General David Petraeus, who was not known for his dovishness on any issue, and I believe that he oversaw the huge troop surge in Iraq, which resulted in untold death, destruction, and misery for the Iraqi people. He warned back in 2010. Look, our relationship with Israel is a strategic liability, which is causing all manner of problems for us domestically and in every corner of the world. And since then, it's only gotten worse. Particularly, of course, due to the 21st century Holocaust in Gaza. It does very much seem that yes, the US is willing to even temporarily downgrade and sideline its relationship with Israel for broader geopolitical gains. Of course, the US has for a very long time been afraid of its traditional Middle East allies, the puppet states in the Gulf, particularly all British installed monarchies, falling into the orbit of China and Russia. Samuel P. Huntington, who was this kind of Cold War quote unquote intellectual, who openly admitted in one of his books, well, most of our policy throughout the Cold War has been manufacturing communist threats in order to justify resource extraction. In his book Clash of Civilizations, outlined a nightmare for the US in the shape of a Sino-Islamic global alliance. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who a hawk on a par with Henry Kissinger, and part of a elite US foreign policy, very influential over many years, wrote a book in the late 90s called The Grand Chessboard, which again stated that a nightmare from the perspective of US policy planners would be a China, Russia, and Iran axis, which has now emerged. So I think that, yeah, Trump understands, and the people around him understand, that there is a desperate scrabble to prevent the various countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, falling ever further into the multipolar order as led by China and Russia. That this is like, again, some kind of desperate bid to prevent that from happening. You've got to bear in mind, back in March, I believe it was March, might have been May, 2023, the Saudis and Iran brokered a pretty historic peace deal under Chinese auspices and direction. And this caught everybody by surprise, including, I know people, residents of West Asia, living in countries that have been rocked by tensions between Saudi and Iran for many years, such as Lebanon, who, when this was first announced, thought that it was fraudulent. Like they thought it was fake news because it was so inconceivable to them that this would happen. It was also inconceivable to them that this would happen without the US's involvement. But lo and behold, the US was kept out of the loop, and then it sent, I believe, Bill Burns, who was the head of the CIA, racing to Riyadh to ask what the hell is going on here.
Yeah.
So it's like. I think that the US is now keen under Trump, and has deliberately cut Israel and very incongruously cut Israel out of its first West Asian tour post Trump's re-election. Trump's very keen to try and cuddle up with various countries in the region, and perhaps try and demonstrate to Netanyahu and these Gulf countries, well, Israel needs us a lot more than we need Israel. But the takeout from that from Saudi Arabia et al. Is actually, you need us a lot more than we need you.
Well, this is the curious position of the Gulf tyrannies, which is that they were founded, all of them, largely by the British, which and the British continue to influence and have a huge say in how they will run. I think still do have a huge say in how they will run. Given the amount of investments that the Qataris, and the UAE and the Oman royals and the Saudis have in London and other places, how much of their money is stashed here. One also has to question the role that the British are playing in all of this, which is, as always, playing a double game. You have the knuckleheads like Keir Starmer screaming Israel till I die, basically in Parliament. It would seem that certain people in the British ruling class are playing a bit of a different game. This is my speculation, given the amount of influence they still wield in the Gulf states and in Saudi Arabia, that I think, and I'm keen to get your opinion on this, there's always been a bit of the British ruling class who see Israel as basically a barrier to doing good business with certain of the oil states. Some in the British ruling class have been very keen on Israel and like to use it to create chaos, as we've covered comprehensively in our 2 episodes on Yugoslavia. If the British ruling class can't completely control something, they'll settle for chaos. But there are some who are like looking to spread their bets a little more evenly. And I think the position of the Gulf states reflects partly the interests of those who run them, who have worked out that nailing themselves to the mast of the ship of US state is not a good idea, given the way that that's changing. And also, there are a lot of interests flowing through the Gulf states and Saudi, who also want to use them to sort of spread their bets. And I think some in the British ruling class are interested in spreading their bets a little bit and have an interest in the Gulf tyrannies being middlemen, essentially being middlemen where you can interact with Iran through Oman, through the UAE, through Qatar, through Saudi. You can interact with Russia through all those places. You can interact with China through all those places, which is part of the reason why these places are aligned with or are in BRICS to play that role. It's the same role Erdogan and the Turks see themselves as playing, which is close to Erdogan is quite close to the British and has been historically, as are the Gulf states. So this is what's also in the mix, but I wanted to get your take on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that interestingly, I think that, of course, yes, the British played a fundamental role in Israel's creation. They wanted a loyal little Ulster in the Middle East, and made numerous moves in that direction. But then there has always been a strand of British thinking which has been like kind of Arab sympathetic for the reasons that you mentioned. I think particularly because they understand that that their relationship with the Gulf states is absolutely fundamental to ensuring access to energy supplies. And I think that funnily enough, within the Conservative Party, there is a much greater strain of pro-Arab thinking, which sometimes ends up manifesting as Palestine solidarity. Now, I mean, there's you have Crispin Blunt, of course, who's this former Tory MP who was like doggedly pro Palestine. You then have Alan Duncan, who was used to work in was an oil trader and then became an MP and had pretty much every god awful Conservative Party position. He held every god-awful imaginable Conservative Party policy, and supported every Anglo-American war of conquest in West Asia and elsewhere, but was also throughout his time in Parliament a vociferous critic of Israel, and in his diaries, which were published after he left office in 2019. There were all manner of incredible excerpts, which I've written about this for the Cradle, where he talks about how the Israeli embassy in London has an enormous influence over the Conservative Party's head office, but via Conservative Friends of Israel. Of course, there is a Labour Friends of Israel as well, with deep and cohering ties to the Israeli embassy in London, which I noticed recently removed all reference to its members. from its website, so you can't see which MPs are part of the of Labour Friends of Israel. So much for open government. But yeah, that like I do think that this Israel Palestine has been a significant wedge between elements of the British establishment for a very long time. I do, and I think that there are elements of the US power structure who, for similar reasons, see that relationship as problematic. As you referenced, I do think that there is sheer bloody-minded optimism that this can all just be blamed on Netanyahu.
Yes.
I think that that there is the foundations of this have been laid for some time, with harsh words spoken about Netanyahu personally. But I mean, throughout the first year or of the Gaza genocide, we were constantly told that Joe Biden was, quote unquote, privately furious with Netanyahu's attitude and conduct, and then meanwhile the money and the bunker buster bombs used to kill children kept flowing. And we were told similar things during Barack Obama's terms in office, that relations between the two of them were constantly strained, but the money and weapons kept flowing. This seems like a more public and concerted effort to basically blame all of the ethnic cleansing, genocide, and Jewish supremacy, which is like baked into Israel's existence, as purely a symptom of Netanyahu's rule. Get rid of him, and everything will be fine again.
Yes.
Israel will go back to being, the Riviera of the Middle East, and having multiple Michelin star restaurants, and will be a tech startup center of the world again. It's not going to happen.
No,
Like,
this is this is done now. I mean, well, not completely finished, but like this is the downward spiral, which is, and part of the delusion that Trump has, or those close to Trump have, is that they can somehow set up some sort of Palestinian puppet state in the West Bank and in Gaza, stick some sort of corrupt PLA administration under the tutelage of the Saudis in there, and then call that peace, and then essentially think that they can stabilize Israel in that way. What they don't understand, and what actually few people do understand, is that Israel's whole basis for existence is to be like an aggressive settler colonial operation. It is to expand. If it doesn't have the ability to expand, it can't solve its internal contradictions. And this is the waves of expansion since really the 70s have been based partly upon the need to resolve Israeli internal contradictions, which is also why, of course, the trajectory of Israeli bourgeois politics continues to slide relentlessly over into like the most sort of apocalyptic, religious-inspired, fascistic garbage, like Itmar Ben-Gvir, the man I refer to as Kurdish Peter Griffin. Look it up online, you'll see the resemblance. Who literally does like meme soy facing in front of bomb damage these days. The point being that like this is like a spiral which can't be interrupted. This is essentially what happens when you try to impose this kind of country in an area of the world with a long history of like very highly civilized, highly civilized societies with a great deal of like scientific and literary and cultural accomplishments. You can't just erase all of that history, nor can you impose like some sort of puppet state on it, which the populace there will resist. Even Thomas Friedman has had to admit that basically that the resistance will continue and Israel can't win. And this is a guy who's been sort of fanatically pro-Israel for his entire career. So game is over. It's just a question now of how it ends. And I think some in the US who are a little bit more intelligent think that they can end it by disposing of Netanyahu. They are about to find out that they can't, and that this monster that they've been carefully cultivating for over well, almost 100 years now, in terms of the British and the Americans, isn't going to go away peacefully. It's going to probably fall in on itself and dissolve in some sort of fratricidal madness, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, I mean, on the subject of fratricidal madness, I mean, I've written about it wouldn't be an edition of Decline and Fall if I didn't shamelessly plug my own website, but you know, I've written about how the Palestinian Authority, which is this completely illegitimate Zionist appendage, the credibility of which is rejected by all who it claims to govern. It's meant to be the government of the West Bank and the official leadership of the Palestinian people. No Palestinians actually support them. I've written about how their security forces were effectively created and trained by the British. Now, the PA security forces routinely carry out absolutely brutal crackdowns on Palestinians themselves doing the Israeli occupation forces work for them. It's kind of outsourced to the PASF, with whom Britain remains heavily embedded, and it runs all their officer courses and provides them with training in torture and the use of weapons and stuff. Now, they were the PA has been vying to take over Gaza as well, and I think that again within the Palestinian Authority, they've created another monster within a monster, because the PA is absolutely terrified of getting sidelined and its power and Western funding and support waning. So, you know, they're going to be pursuing their own agenda, potentially causing problems, stirring up issues on the ground. I believe it was in February this year, the PASF started unilaterally carrying out an absolutely brutal attack on the West Bank, particularly the Jenin refugee camp, which is this resistance stronghold. And they murdered and maimed many civilians and even journalists along the way, because they were desperately trying to prove, hey, we can police Gaza and keep it Hamas free. So when the Israeli state collapses, and it's a matter of when, not if, you're going to have a even bigger mess on your hands. The British and the Americans. There are going to be like different power blocks are going to emerge. Different armed groups are probably going to emerge. It's going to be an absolutely massive disaster. And I think and just to round this out as well, is that, I mean, this is something that we've discussed before on the show, but it does bear repeating, is that one of the seeds of Israel's destruction, which is hardwired into its very foundations, is, as you say, this need to expand constantly. And Netanyahu has made clear that he wants to be remembered as the leader who helped create Greater Israel by seizing chunks of Lebanon and Syria permanently. But the problem is that Israel doesn't have the muscle or the money or the people to keep expanding. So it's like its only means of being able to maintain its constant thirst for seizing further territory is to get the US involved on their side directly. But as we've discussed, the US is not going to do that. That's why the Israeli leadership is still, despite that very damaging New York Times leak, which was about Israel's plans to attack Iran, which was quite obviously a targeted leak to warn the Israelis off doing this. It's why they're still committed to carrying out a quote-unquote limited strike on Tehran, because they think that is, in the manner of the British engaging in all of this in escalations in Ukraine, it's the way of keeping the Americans in. Because hey, they when it comes to it, they will come to our rescue. No, they won't. They've just thrown you under the bus. And I think that that Huckabee's comments. I mean, Huckabee is like an evangelical ultra-conservative Christian lunatic who, upon being nominated as Washington's ambassador to Israel, said that he was going to start referring to Israel openly and publicly in biblical terms, such as the Promised Land. He has a history of saying that Jews have a right and duty to seize Palestinian territory as they see fit. And then even he turns around when Israel, Israeli officials learned of the Ansar Allah US ceasefire agreement via TV news reports, and were extremely angry that they've been frozen out of this process. And then even Huckabee, of all people, is like, well, we don't need your permission to do anything.
Well,
and I think
yes.
and I think and just sorry, just to close this out, there's a lot of mainstream reporting on the Iranian nuclear deal, which makes clear that Israel is not being consulted on this either, and that they're seen as being a wrench in the works of actually achieving anything. So they're completely frozen out, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, and it just goes to show, like, for people said, and I think a lot of people who really should have known better said for a long time, oh, Israel's running the show in the United States. This isn't true. I mean, it was never true. What has happened is that even people like Huckabee have been revealed for like what they actually are, which is, for all his faux Christian posturing and for all of his like talk of the promised land and all that kind of stuff. The only religion of Mike Huckabee is the religion of the US empire. That's the truest expression of it. It's fuck all to do with the Bible. It's everything to do with like empire worship, and he's a dedicated servant of it, and so he'll do what he's told. And if we go off other Christian pastors like Pastor John Hagee, who are supposedly pro-Israel, well, try and find out what their opinions on the Jews are in actual reality. It's not favorable. And the reason why, like, the more lunatic of these people are pro-Israel is because they think all the Jews have to be pushed there, then sacrificed before the Messiah can return. Doesn't sound too promising to me. But to go back to the point about like in the era of decaying empire, like everything that the imperial officialdom tries to do to restabilize the situation ultimately only makes things worse. So they can get rid of Netanyahu if they want to. They could push him out. It wouldn't stabilize Israel, not in the slightest. It would actually make things far less stable, because for all that he's a crook and a villain of the worst kind and a murderer and everything else that people say about him, and that's what his friends say about him, he's actually the only one in Israeli politics who's been able to put together stable coalitions for the last 20 years. That's the reality. And if he goes, then what you're going to have is a bunch of people who are a bunch of political inadequates fighting like rats in a sack over like who gets to run the crumbling remains of Israel. In the end, my suspicion, I mean, we're into the realm of speculation here, is that some sort of international force would need to be put together to essentially to secure the Israeli nuclear assets when the Israeli state is no longer viable anymore. So, I mean, a potential example, and I could be wrong about this, is like you could end up with the US having to deploy directly to Israel to essentially stabilize the situation as the Israeli state falls apart, in order to get the nuclear assets under control and anything else that's important, much the same way the British had to deploy to Rhodesia to stabilize it just before the deal there that turned it into Zimbabwe. That's for future speculations, though, but I don't know if you wanted to comment on that before we moved on.
Yeah, well, no, I completely agree, and I think that that as I say, it is understood that that there are deep structural problems which are reaching a kind of culmination point now, and that any post Netanyahu Israel is going to be deeply unstable and dangerous, because like the insane nationalism preached by Likud and Netanyahu, like it does cut across a significant swaths of Israeli society. And I mean, you've got to bear in mind that there's the Samson option. I mean, it's just quite like a lot of people aren't aware of this, but because of well, why would they? But why would they be? But there was a Israeli military professor called Martin van Creveld, who effectively stated that, we have the means to take down the world with us, and that will happen before Israel does, right? So, like, there's going to be a large number of people who, if they can get the launch codes and their finger is hovering over the button, probably would push it. And the US is aware of this, yeah, and so yeah, I can totally imagine some kind of formal deployment there as thing by Western forces as things wind down, and Netanyahu is either executed via firing squad or flown to Poland or Miami or wherever he. I gather his son is living it up in Florida at the moment, evading conscription, of course. But like, yeah, I have been saying for a very, very, very long time that Israel is running on fumes. Its economy is in absolute tatters, and it's not going to recover. It is entirely dependent on the US underwriting its economy effectively and underwriting all of its loans with major financial institutions, and also it depends on direct US financial aid. It is suffering a ever worsening population collapse, which would probably be even worse if Ansarallah hadn't closed Israel's airspace, and all of these airlines like Virgin had permanently cancelled all flights to and from Israel. Yeah, like it's in its death throes. It is obviously a crying pity that they are going out in a flurry of blood and slaughter and malnutrition in Gaza. But I mean, there's no going back, only downwards for them at this point.
Yeah, exactly right. And so if we look then at the shall we say the giant risk board that is laid out in front of us, and nerds of a certain generation will know what I'm referring to here, and the pushing around of the forces around the board, we turn our attention, of course, to the Ukraine situation. Now, again, various different interested parties are circling around Ukraine, including in a vulture-like fashion. But as we have talked about many times on this program, and in fact, it is probably the subject to which we return to the most, the differing interests and overlapping interests in whether the war should be stopped or carried on, and like the whether there should be some kind of peace settlement or what that should look like, is the subject of like fevered speculation and arguments in the West as to what should happen next. The general line that the more militant elements in Washington and London seem to be taking now is that they do want some kind of pause in the war, if only so that the Kiev regime can be stabilized. They can perhaps return some of those Ukrainian men who have gone into refugee status across Europe and Britain, shove them back into Ukraine, rearm it, and then have another go at the Russians in a few years' time. That seems to be some of what is currently the thinking in London and Washington. Others want to put in place a more permanent freeze. Others don't know what the fuck to do. And all of that is reflected in the chaos around the Trump administration's approach to these things, which has no less than 2, possibly 3 separate sets of negotiators circulating at any one time. You have like Vitkov, who seems to be Trump's guy in both West Asia and Eastern Europe. You have Rubio popping up and saying all kinds of things before he runs off back to his true passion, which is trying to overthrow the Cuban government. And you have Kellogg circulating around as well. None of which leads to a particularly hopeful set of negotiations opening up in Istanbul at the moment, where there was speculation that Putin was going to turn up. And then, of course, Putin doesn't turn up. Of course he doesn't. But the Financial Times has run an interesting piece basically saying that Zelensky's going down there. There is some efforts to sort of force some kind of settlement, but all of the talk coming from the more clued up quarters in the US and elsewhere says that these talks are going to lead to nothing remotely positive anytime soon, and that they're basically it's going to be a farce. Kit, what's your interpretation?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it was what there was a wonderful contrast in imagery on Victory Day, May 9th, when which was Pavel Wagen drew attention to on Twitter or X, which was that, you know, while all of the heads of state, of which there were many from every corner of the globe, were posing together for pictures following the Russia's victory parade in Moscow, at the same time, Macron, Starmer, and a couple of other losers from Europe were sat in this rather dingy room round a small table, presumably going over the same talking points, achieving nothing of substance, to very little interest. And I think
they might have been having a cocaine party. You never know.
Yeah. There's also that. But the jury remains out on that one. But I think that basically what is interesting is we've not heard much in the way of yapping from the Baltics or Britain or France ever since the Times, as we went into in some detail, very quietly stated that plans for deploying Western troops to Ukraine had been scrapped, which was effectively a Suez 2.0, without a shot being fired, without an aircraft being scrambled, without a ship being deployed. After months and months of Starmer saying, I am ready and willing and able to deploy British soldiers to Ukraine, suddenly anonymous Ministry of Defence officials are briefing the Times saying, we always thought it was an insane idea and we didn't have the forces for it, and we didn't want to do it, and it was always the French that wanted to, nothing to do with us. And I think that this report by the FT, and this was published before Putin made clear he wasn't going to attend, and sent a kind of a B team, referred to as less prominent negotiators by the Washington Post, even Friedrich Merz, who, after campaigning for a while on the need for talks and a negotiated settlement on Ukraine, suddenly became hyper hawkish on the campaign trail and was calling for German missiles to strike Russian cities. He is quoted in this FT piece as saying he admired Zelensky's willingness to compromise, but added, I believe more compromise and more concessions are no longer reasonable. So that's taking a kind of hawkish tone, while also saying, we kind of need to wrap this up, in a mutual, in the kind of least damaging way to Ukraine possible. Now, what's interesting is when you go to buried at the very bottom of the very final paragraph of this FT piece on, at last there are peace talks in Istanbul. Ukrainian intelligence officials are reported as saying Russia appears to be gearing up for a larger offensive, moving forces to key hotspots on the battlefield rather than signaling a readiness for peace talks. Anyone who has actually, been paying attention to what's been happening on the front line, and there are live maps, and there are channels like History Legends, which offer fantastic analysis of the special military operation, and there are people like Armchair Warlord, likewise on Twitter, knows this is what Russia has been planning for and making practical undertakings for a very long time. They are seizing territory at a rate of knots, and they are positioning themselves for an absolutely massive offensive in the summer. I don't want to speculate about where they will be aiming for. I strongly suspect that they will be aiming to push further, at least towards Odessa. There could be a renewed attempt to seize Kharkov. So this is happening reflects that the Ukraine, to say nothing of the US and Europe, don't have any cards here. Right, there are no plans for a European or any Western peacekeeping force to enter Ukraine. Ukraine is only now getting some military support from the US in return for signing a series of very one-sided deals with the US, the details of which Zelensky refuses to go into, but effectively amount to bending over and asking, have I bent over far enough yet for you, to Trump. Now, this article that you have on screen by Alex Vershinin is very interesting. Now, Alex he is a military veteran, and he's also a regular writer for the Royal United Services Institute, which is this very hawkish British state-funded and aligned think tank. Now, Alex has previously written, since the war started, he provided a lot of critical commentary on the performance of the Ukrainians, but also the fact that the kind of conflict that was occurring in the fields of Donbass was not one the West was prepared in any way to fight and had never fought before, right? And he was also talking about as far back as 2022, I think, was talking about the fact that the US and Europe do not have the industrial base or the capability, the resources, or the energy capabilities to be building artillery shells and ammunition and military vehicles on the scale, anything like the scale necessary to even think about engaging in a conflict such as the one that is currently happening. The fact that this was republished in Responsible Statecraft, which is a very good resource in general, for as far as mainstream kind of foreign policy think tanks go, it is by far and away the best. Maybe not the most competitive category, but it is all about how Ukraine's battlefield position is deteriorating fast. And he makes a point that I think we've made on this show, and many people, again, like History Legends and Armchair Warlord and people who actually know what they're talking about, have made, which is the Russians don't give a shit about capturing further territory currently. Their primary objective and thrust is to decimate the Ukrainian army and leave the Ukraine in a position where it is effectively defenseless, and Russian forces can therefore easily advance. The initial thrust of the war in February 2022 specifically avoided, with the sole exception of the encirclement and capture of Mariupol. The initial waves of the invasion ignored cities, because cities are extremely and notoriously difficult to take and hold. Even hanging on to Bucha was costly for the Russians. That's a town near Kiev where they absolutely didn't carry out a genocide of the local population, and Ukraine may well have done so, but that's a subject for a different show. But even holding on to that bit of territory, engaged pretty much daily battles with Ukrainian forces, and it was relentlessly shelled by the Ukrainian army. Alex talks about how that Ukraine is in a very, very, very bad position. It is not going to increase at most. What further Western military aid is just going to prolong this and delay the inevitable. Ukraine does not have the ability to replenish its losses. Whether that's in the form of military vehicles or ammunition, or perhaps most important of all, people. That effectively Ukraine needs to sue for peace now. But the difficulty that we see here is that on some level, despite the fact that the rhetoric has been toned down, if not put on mute, the kind of hawkish, belligerent, empty threats of Macron, and Starmer have reduced, there is still seemingly this resistance to entering serious peace talks. Now, serious peace talks would not only include the Russian government at its highest levels, they would also acknowledge and have to acknowledge that the West and Ukraine have zero leverage or bargaining position, really, beyond lifting of sanctions, which the Russian officials don't seem overly desperate to resolve, to put it mildly. There's very little the West can offer Russia, to stop fighting. Any proposition which this has been talked about for when it became very clear that Ukraine was on the losing end of this and was in a very dire position in 2023. There were people who were saying, well, we need to pause the fighting, give Ukraine a couple of years to rebuild its forces, and then they can win. There still seems to be people clinging on to this idea. The Kremlin is never going to allow it, because why would they?
Well, it would create, if the Russian government agreed to the kind of peace that Donald Trump, or let alone Keir Starmer, is thinking of, it would not meet any of their objectives, and also would create severe domestic problems for them. That's the other point about it. And again, then the West isn't looking at that at all. And the other point is that they don't seem to understand that the Russians are prepared to go to the point where they completely destroy the Kiev regime. Now, maybe some in Russia would prefer to do that by negotiations, but that is not how things are going at the moment. And it looks as if what they're actually going to need to do is to essentially knock out the Kiev regime once and for all, and are preparing to do so in a military offensive this summer, which we don't know the destination of it yet, but that is certainly on the cards now, as even J.D. Vance has admitted. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that what's very interesting, and again, I think that we called this pretty on point, was that we made clear that, well, when it was announced that it was said that Donald Trump and Rubio wanted a serious move on peace talks, or they were just going to give up on them entirely. This was interpreted in mainstream quarters as, well, if we don't get successful peace talks, it's back to full-blown balls to the wall proxy war with Russia. No, that was never going to be the case. And here, at the very start of May, this was when Zelensky was signing all of these capitulatory deals with the US, desperately begging them for continued financial and military support. J.D. Vance admitted that the war in Ukraine won't end anytime soon. I mean, I actually disagree. I think that it could end a lot quicker than a lot of people are expecting, because like I mean, Russia hasn't shown any interest in leveling Kiev, let alone seizing the city. But I mean, the Ukrainian armed forces are absolutely disheveled at this point. I mean, it's the advances that Russia is making are absolutely massive. There is very little in the way of resistance. The Ukrainian military bloggers, who are usually very pro Zelensky and pro Ukraine's armed forces, are saying that all we've really got left in our arsenal are drones, and the Russians are finding ways of countering them. You know, in the spirit of gradually, then rapidly, once the front line collapses, I think that the time will have come for big arrow advances, because there won't be any opposition. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, JD Vance said the war isn't going anywhere. It's not going to end anytime soon. But I mean, we shall see what happens after the summer.
Well, yes, and the point to emphasize here is that no matter what the handlers in London and those who are still invested in the Kiev regime in Washington actually want, the reality is, if the Ukrainian forces can't hold the front line anymore, there's nothing London and Washington can do anymore. Never mind Paris and Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but it's like, I mean, that's the thing, is that, I mean, I actually, to tie this in with some, again, shameless plug, something that I wrote for my website, which I was chuffed at the feedback. I wrote an investigation into the Anglo-Nazi global empire that almost was. Now, this is, to say the least, hidden history, which very, very, very few people know, which is that appeasement, which was a policy of turning, according to mainstream narratives, a policy of turning a blind eye to Germany's breaches of the Versailles Treaty in the 1930s, and making certain concessions to Hitler for peace's sake. That's the mainstream reading. The reality was that it was meant to be laying the foundations of, yes, as I say, a global Anglo-Nazi empire. There were, throughout 1939, discussions being had at the highest levels of the British and Nazi German governments on a quote unquote world political partnership, with Nazi Germany helping Britain run its empire, because it had gotten so vast. The British themselves couldn't effectively manage it anymore. There were these very serious discussions being had, and per an individual called Albert Dirksen, who was Nazi Germany's ambassador to London in the 18 months leading up to World War II, when he said that he wrote a post-mortem of what happened, which was never intended for public consumption, which I report on, and he talks about the tragic and paramount thing of the new global conflict between Germany and England, which is that Britain was willing to concede to all of Nazi Germany's demands, and they were willing to consider, yes, global political and economic partnership. But from the Britain's perspective, this had to be done gradually. It had to be done over months and years rather than days and weeks, which is what Hitler wanted. Now, I strongly suspect that was the reason for British reluctance on this point, was that they were desperate to go out on their own terms. Like, they didn't want to admit defeat yet. Like, they were still clinging to this idea of, oh yeah, well, we're not as big as the US anymore, and oh, we're being outstripped in this field by Nazi Germany, and blah blah blah. But like, we're still the world's biggest empire, so if we're going to go out, we're going to do it our way, right? And I think that there's probably an element of this thinking now, where in the US, and I mean particularly Europe, they realize that they're absolutely toast and there is absolutely nothing that they can do, let alone threaten, which is going to deter the Russians from seeing this conflict out to its final conclusion, on terms dictated by Moscow itself. But they are just still struggling to acclimatize to that reality. It's like they know it,
Yes.
but they
Mm.
just but they know it's true, but they just wish it wasn't. And it's
Mm.
I mean I did see that Macron had said, you know, if Russia doesn't get this wrapped up, you know, we're going to ramp up the sanctions. I mean, you know, this is after 3 years of the Russian economy in many ways being strengthened by the by the sanctions, and European economies being utterly decimated. I mean, you know, again, it's fantasy world stuff, but to have gone from pre-February 2022, Britain and Germany and France, all having well entrenched delusions about their own economic, political, and military power. I think Britain and France, particularly on the military side. You know, I think that yes, the reality has dawned, slash is dawning, but they're not ready to give it up yet. Like
No.
they're not just yet, and they're scrabbling to find some way of framing total capitulation and surrender on favorable terms.
Hmm. Well, they are trying to make it to preserve their, shall we say, their ability to project or look as if they can project power elsewhere, which of course they can't do anymore. And
Yeah,
that's one of the big things to realize, which is that they are stuck now. That if they try to preserve everything, they'll end up preserving nothing. But if they try to amine themselves to actually losing something, they'll end up losing everything anyway. So there's no easy way out for them now. And this is, of course, in essence, the nature of our program, which is to track this very real decline and fall that is going on in front of our eyes as we illustrate week to week. But I think that brings us very much to the end of this
yeah.
particular program, Kit. My thanks to you as always for joining me for this tour down the
Likewise.
highways and byways of collapsing empire. Thanks to everybody who has subscribed to the Substack thus far and supports the show that way. Again, your support makes all of this possible, and we will continue to be your guides through this swirling vortex of chaos as the Anglo-American era comes shuddering to a halt. And we'll be back with you again next week with some very exciting programs, including the forthcoming program on African liberation to be brought to you very soon. But until then, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks to everybody who supports the program, and we'll be back with you again very soon.
See you soon, guys. Take care.